Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride, and in a few minutes we'll be going to an interview I recorded a little bit earlier today with Gavin Newlands MP regarding the bill that he is trying to shepherd through the UK Parliament, which he hopes will prevent workers from being fired and then rehired on reduced terms and conditions. We'll get into all that and more in just a few minutes. But first, we have today's news headlines. And we start, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 1,024,825 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 954,093 were confirmed negative, 70,732 were positive. There were 1,072 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly there were 31 new reported deaths. This will of course be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not everyone will necessarily get tested. Again, we do urge you, if you are showing symptoms of a new persistent dry cough, a temperature or a change in your sense of taste or smell, then please do book a test as soon as you can. Of the people who have tested positive in Scotland, there were 1,237 people in hospital last night, 98 of whom were in intensive care. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,997. This number only includes those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures show that 48,475 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 355 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And travellers arriving in Scotland from Denmark must quarantine for 14 days from today. The requirement to self-isolate at home or another specified address took effect from 12:30 this afternoon. The decision to remove Denmark from the quarantine exemption list is being taken on the basis of public health advice, following discussions on Thursday evening between all 4 chief medical officers in the UK about reported cases in humans of a variant strain of the coronavirus associated with outbreaks in mink farms in Denmark. Similar decisions have been made by all 4 nations. The US presidential election remains undecided after almost 3 days of counting, and it looks unlikely that a winner can be definitively named for at least a few more days. Democrat Joe Biden holds a lead of around 4 million in the popular vote, but things are still much more precarious in the Electoral College. Currently, with almost all votes counted, Biden holds slim leads in important states including Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia, and perhaps most importantly, Pennsylvania. However, recounts have already been announced for Georgia and Wisconsin and may be necessary in other states too. If Biden's lead in these states hold, he would win a fairly comfortable Electoral College victory. However, in a rambling speech last night and in further statements by his campaign today, Republican President Donald Trump alleged conspiracies and corruption designed to steal the election from him, with no real basis in fact. He has initiated a series of legal challenges in key states to halt the counting of postal votes and to challenge the overall legitimacy of the election by claiming intimidation and exclusion of election observers. Most of these cases will be quickly dismissed as without basis, but Trump will hope to sow as much confusion and distrust as possible to reinforce his narrative. The SNP has warned that the Tories' attempts to employ tactics straight out of the Trump playbook to deny the people of Scotland a say over their future is unsustainable, undemocratic, and doomed to fail. In an interview with BBC Scotland, Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack continued to dig in and state that the Westminster Tory government will deny the people of Scotland a say in a fresh independence referendum. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon tweeted in response, "As we're seeing across the Atlantic just now, politicians who rage against democracy don't prevail. Let's not dignify this rubbish. Instead, let's keep making and winning the case for independence. Power doesn't belong to politicians, it belongs to the people. Jack's comments come after a 12th consecutive poll yesterday revealed majority support for independence, and the SNP on course to return a majority at next year's Holyrood elections. Billions of pounds worth of trade with the European Union will face significant disruption on the 1st of January, regardless of whether a trade deal is agreed, Whitehall's spending watchdog has concluded. The National Audit Office said crucial IT systems have yet to be tested and transit areas for lorries are not ready, as the government attempts to prepare new border controls for the end of the Brexit transition period. The planned controls, which had already been rated high risk, have been further hampered by the coronavirus pandemic, according to a report released today. Officials have still not taken the steps required to ensure that there were enough customs agents, auditors said, while civil contingency plans to maintain the supply of medicines and acquire extra freight capacity away from the main channel crossings have been difficult to enact due to COVID-19. The Home Office has been accused of breaching a High Court order that halts the eviction of asylum seekers during the pandemic lockdown. During the first lockdown in March, the eviction of refused asylum seekers from Home Office accommodation was paused for public health reasons to protect asylum seekers and the general public from COVID-19. Street homelessness was thought to lead to higher rates of infection due to issues like sofa surfing. On Saturday, the Home Office faced questions about whether it would pause evictions of asylum seekers again during the new restrictions. The government replied that while the policy was under review, evictions and deportations, as well as withdrawal of financial support, were all now back to normal. However, on Monday, a High Court judge, Mr. Justice Fordham, had issued a court order instructing the Home Office to halt evictions because of those same public health concerns. While this was only an interim ruling pending a further hearing, lawyers from the Greater Manchester Law Centre who obtained the injunction have expressed concern that the Home Office still would not commit to abiding by it. The SNP is celebrating yet another by-election victory after Miranda Radley was elected as the councillor for Kincorth, Nigg and Cove today. The SNP achieved an impressive 47.4% of first preference votes, with the Tories and Labour trailing behind on just 20.2 and 12.2 respectively. The by-election was called after the SNP's Stephen Flynn beat the Tories at last year's UK general election to become the MP for Aberdeen South. Scottish Green MSP Andy Whiteman has criticised inaction by the Scottish Government after it emerged England is doing more to prevent private tenants from being evicted this winter. Measures in the 4-week lockdown in England means temporary protections for tenants living in areas under the old Tier 2 and Tier 3 restrictions in England and Wales that prevent bailiffs enforcing court possession orders are extended. Commenting, Andy Whiteman said, England's lockdown effectively prevents evictions for months, but in Scotland we are approaching 140 evictions since the country locked down. No one should lose their home during a public health emergency such as this, and the Scottish Government need to recognise that what we have in place does not prevent that happening. And finally, students across Scotland are to be offered access to more support to help them deal with the mental health impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. Additional Scottish Government funding will allow support staff to carry out more frequent checks to identify potential mental health issues, as well as wider welfare concerns such as access to food deliveries and other necessities. The funding will also help to increase the number of drop-in chats for students, which will offer counselling on a digital platform. Staff will also be able to direct students to the appropriate services, including referring them to a clinician, if appropriate. So that is all of today's headlines, and now we go, as I said earlier, to an interview we recorded with Gavin Newlands earlier today. So I'm joined now by Gavin Newlands, the MP for Paisley and Renfrewshire North. Gavin, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I suppose the first question I want to ask is just how you have been doing. You're in Renfrewshire just now, I believe. But how have you been coping with the pandemic and obviously the travel back and forth to Westminster?
Well, it's been difficult, but it's been difficult for all of us, and even worse for many others, sadly. But it's about trying to find a balance because travelling back and forth when obviously we really best it's best not to be travelling when we don't need to. But sadly, as an MP, I can't take part in debates in Westminster or present bills in terms of legislation. I can't do any of those things from my home. I can ask questions, but I can't take part in debates. And obviously, at this point in time, with so many of my constituents' jobs on the line, whether it's furlough related or aviation support or whatever it happens to be, I think I have to be there to put those concerns on behalf of my constituents at times. But it's about trying to get that balance. But it is extremely difficult, and obviously, like everyone else, I've got family, and it's been difficult to not be able to see that family, my mum, etc., as much as I'd like, and trying to persuade my mum not to go shopping, and that I would get it for her has been rather problematic.
Yeah. Now, obviously, there is a bill that you're working on, the fire and rehire bill, and we are going to talk about that in some depth. I just wanted to ask as well, though, before we do that, the new restrictions that have been introduced in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, we've seen the tier system introduced in Scotland, but we've seen stricter lockdown reintroduced, at least for a short period, in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I wonder, just having given that you're moving between those two, I wonder what you make of these new restrictions. Do you think Scotland has gone far enough? Do you think maybe England and the other parts of the UK have gone too far, or do you think these are all pretty much about what's needed at the moment?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm certainly no expert, and I do not envy the First Minister and her colleagues one little bit when it comes to making these decisions, extremely difficult decisions that she has to make on behalf of the country. Um, but on the whole, I think you've seen that the Scottish Government has tended to take decisions quicker, take the actions that are necessary little bit quicker than the UK Government on behalf of England. So that's why you see the virus not getting to the same level in Scotland as it is in England, and that's why at this point in time, perhaps the restrictions that we have in place maybe will be enough rather than the full lockdown that Boris Johnson has just announced for England. But again, time will tell, and the First Minister's absolutely right to leave that as an option for Scotland if the numbers aren't coming down as much as they need them to do so.
Well, obviously, we'll have to wait and see about all of that. But as I said, you've been proposing this bill to make it illegal for certain types of sacking and then rehiring of workers. I wanted to ask, first of all, how did this issue come to your attention? How did this one end up on your desk?
Yeah, I'll be honest, it's something I hadn't come across before. I've since been made aware that it's something that ASDA had done a couple of years ago, but it hadn't come across my desk at that point in time. But at the start of this pandemic, obviously aviation was one of the quickest industries that was hit, and it's probably one of the hardest hit industries as well. And obviously, I've got Glasgow Airport in my constituency, and I'm also the transport spokesperson for the SNP at Westminster. So I had um, a number of constituents and people from across the UK get in touch with me when British Airways decided that they were going to fire and rehire staff. And British Airways had planned to fire their entire workforce, pretty much of 42,000 staff, and rehire 30,000 of them on significantly reduced terms and conditions. So they intended to get rid of around 12,000 of the workforce and rehire the rest on slash terms and conditions. And for some of their longer serving members, that meant actual cuts in their take home pay of 50, 60, plus 60% plus. And it's not just minor 5 to 10% cuts, which you might see across other businesses, but these cuts were vast, and those actions were unjustifiable. No one no one is saying that businesses, particularly in areas like aviation, are those hugely affected by the pandemic, don't have to take action. But the actions that the British Airways decided to take were um, Dickensian and really unforgivable.
And I wonder why has this not been illegal before? I mean, it seems like it should be fairly obvious that to be able to make people redundant is meant to be a kind of last ditch measure. It doesn't seem like something that companies should be able to use just to cut costs and bypass normal negotiations with unions. Why has this not been dealt with sooner?
Absolutely, it's a question I've asked many times myself. Obviously, many countries in Europe, the practice of firing, rehiring to reduce terms and conditions is illegal. For instance, in the British Airways case, they operate obviously in Britain. The parent company IAG operates in Britain with British Airways, but Ireland with Aer Lingus and Spain with Iberia, Vueling, and other airlines. In Ireland and Spain, they couldn't threaten their staff with firing and rehiring. It's only the British Airways workforce that was faced with this. But it's really a throwback to another era, in my view. I know that this Tory government, it doesn't have a lot of time for trade unions, but a contract should still be worth something. A contract should give the employee and the employer some protections. But if you allow fire and rehiring, it essentially only gives the employer protections, and that just isn't right.
So, what is in the bill then? How do you come about drafting a bill like this when you're not in government? How does that process start?
Well, with a lot of help. To be honest, I'm not a drafter of legislation. I'm not a lawyer. Um, so you employ the help of one, the Public Bill Office in Westminster. Westminster and the House of Commons, for all its uh, faults, and we could be here all day talking about the various flaws and how it operates and how it functions. But there are a great many staff behind the scenes, like in the House of Commons Library and Public Bill Office, who are exceptional at what they do. And when we approached them with this idea of wanting to take action, um, they helped with not just the idea on how to do it, but then drew the legislation up as well. So wouldn't be anywhere without their support, but also unions. We've been engaging with unions, particularly Unite, over a number of months, and so I'm grateful to them for their assistance in getting to this point. That being said, as an opposition MP taking forward what essentially amounts to a private member's bill, it's very unlikely to actually see the light of day in terms of getting a second reading and advancing in the Commons unless the government were to actually adopt the bill themselves or take forward their own measures. So it's about keeping the issue on the table, and that's why I had the bill tabled back in June, but an opening came up. Tabled the bill, would not be able to speak to it because it was so far down the order paper that in a private member's bill day it would never actually get to the bill in terms of the order. So an opportunity became open in terms of a 10-minute real bill slot. So I pulled my original bill and retabled it and was able to speak to it for 10 minutes. So at least I could put over the merits of the bill, which has huge cross-party support. The I know that a great many Conservative backbenchers have pressured the Minister with regard to the issue, and you can see from the bill itself that every party in the House is represented as a sponsor of the bill. So there's no doubt there's an actual majority for action on this issue. We're just waiting on the government to accept that and get on board.
Now, you mentioned there's significant cross-party support. So, what kind of support have you had? What amongst the Tories, for example, how many backbench Tories have shown an interest in supporting this?
Well, it's always difficult securing public support. I've had Tories sign this version of the bill or sponsor this version of the bill and the previous version, I've had Conservative backbenchers sign um, uh, cross-party letters when I had a letter that had over 100 signatures, etc. But you've also had Conservative backbenchers on repeated occasions bring the issue up, whether it's transport questions or other opportunities in Parliament. They've raised this issue and challenged the government to take action on British Airways, but also called British Airways out for their behaviour. So there has been significant support, but it's always problematic, and a lot of Tories will take their support will be lobbying the minister behind the scenes, and the minister has admitted that that has gone on in quite some fashion. The other side of the house, in terms of the Labour Party, they're clearly supportive of the bill, and obviously many of the backbenchers have signed it and have came to photo calls on the issue, etc. But sadly, twice there's been a fire and rehire debate scheduled by the Labour front bench on 2 opposition days, and they've had to pull them. And I don't really make any criticism of the Labour Party for that, because circumstances have dictated of those changes. I just hope that they do bring it back as soon as possible, so that we can actually debate this over the course of 3 or 6 hours, potentially even, rather than just me making a 10-minute speech to the virtues of the bill.
And you mentioned as well that you've had significant trade union support. I mean, I imagine the unions that represent BA workers would be top of that list. But I wonder, why do you think they've come through you rather than, as they might traditionally have gone through the Labour Party to try and get something like this done?
Well, I'm not sure if it was unions coming through me. It was me that took the decision to take this issue forward. I had been addressing the issue and had made a couple of points and said in urgent questions or what have you. I can't even remember the exact circumstances when I said this should be illegal, and it was only kind of at that point I'm like, hang on a minute, I'm a lawmaker here. I can at least try and make it illegal. So that's when we came up with the idea for the bill, and obviously we approached the unions, and there's been a great level of engagement on that front. So I think it's because I took the issue forward. So I don't need to be any kind of criticism of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer has addressed it in his virtual conference speech, and Keir Starmer was also present when I gave my 10-minute rule bill speech on Wednesday, and when I suggested that Labour would be bringing this back for an opposition day debate, he turned and nodded his head. So I'm hopeful that this will be a cross-party effort. It's not just about me or the SNP. It will be about ourselves, the SNP, Lib Dems, and Conservative backbenchers. That if we get action on this, it will be as a result of all of a sum of all those parts.
So tell us a wee bit then about what's actually in the bill. What specifically would it do to the rights of workers?
Well, it's extremely simple. I don't think there'll be many more bills that will be as straightforward as this. It's a simple 2-clause bill, and one just says where it is enacted. All it does is make the firing and rehiring of staff with the view of reducing their terms and conditions, or for the purpose of reducing their terms and conditions. All it does is add it to the list of actions that represent unfair dismissal. So it allows the employee to take the employer to an employment tribunal, and obviously the burden of proof as to the veracity or necessity of the actions will therefore fall on the employer. But it couldn't be any more straightforward. I don't. If we have action, I'll be surprised if it's this specific action. That, to me, that seems the most straightforward way of doing things. But I suspect that if we are to get any progress with the government, it might well be something else. But the bill itself is simplicity itself.
Now, obviously, getting a private member's bill passed is not an easy job. As you said, the easiest way for this to get passed would be for the government to adopt it. Is there any sense that the government might be interested in doing that? And if not, what other options do you have? What chance is there of making something happen with the bill?
I'm not convinced that they'll adopt the bill. I mean, obviously, I've met with the minister, and the minister said they weren't minded to support the bill in its first incarnation at that point in time, but was open to further discussions on the issue. And we heard just a week or two ago, we also heard a Treasury Minister, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury actually, in response to a Labour MP, say that he was keen to perhaps look at the issue and see what could be done. So I think there's definitely warm words in the door as ajar in terms of getting action or taking action, and that action kind of falling short of making unfair dismissal can put big hurdles in the way of employers carrying out this action by putting the burden of proof on the employer to show that the business was perhaps was about to collapse if they didn't have if they didn't take this action, etc. There are kind of halfway houses that would offer much deeper and further protections for employees than we have at present, short of making it illegal. And I'm more than happy to discuss any of these routes with the government as long as we get these protections in place, because there's never been a more perilous time with the pandemic and what have you for the workforce, and we need to make sure that they have appropriate protections in place.
Now, obviously, you said you initially raised this in June, and at the time, I remember us hearing that BA was planning this. Have any companies actually been doing this during the pandemic, and is there any action that could be taken in retrospect for those workers?
Um, I'm not sure about retrospect. That's obviously a discussion. If we were to make any progress on the issue, that's certainly a discussion we'd have to have with the government. In terms of other companies, obviously British Airways were very much the leader in this issue, and the sheer scale of what they were trying to do, and the scale of the cuts that they were trying to make terms and conditions were horrendous. We did say at that time, if the government didn't take action, then other businesses would follow, and that has happened. You've had, for instance, Menzies Aviation and not based in my constituency, but obviously at Glasgow Airport. I had a conversation with them, and they had said they had absolutely no intention of going down the same route. Actually, were quite critical of British Airways in a phone call with me, which I don't usually share. But the fact that they said they absolutely wouldn't be going down that route, and then about a fortnight later decided that they would actually be firing and rehiring staff. The other main one would be British Gas, Scottish Gas, Centrica, who have threatened thousands of staff with firing and rehiring. They are still engaging with the unions and haven't actually served notice on anyone yet. But if I come back to British Airways have said, and the outgoing chief exec gave evidence to the Transport Select Committee, of which I'm a member, just a few weeks ago, had said that fire and rehiring was off the table. And that is just disingenuous twaddle to me, because back in March or April, they threatened 42,000 staff with firing and rehiring. Um, X thousand, just over 10,000 people now have left the business. X thousand took voluntary redundancy at that point in time because they were being threatened with being fired and rehired. They then carried through with that process, and at the times they said, so they then selected, of the people who wanted to come back to the business, British Airways selected who was coming back and who was again then being made redundant, and that happened. And then they said to take fire and rehire off the table. Well, the threat had already been made, and people had made decisions on that basis. And to be honest, with the changes that have been made, in effect, the staff that remain, they have it's not a different contract, but it's a massively changed contract. So in effect, it's almost they have been fired and rehired anyway. Plus, there's sections of the business that absolutely still face being fired and rehired over the course of the next couple of months. So it's disingenuous at best. For British Airways and IAG to say that fire and rehire is off the table.
And obviously, you've had these discussions with the companies. Has there been any response from BA or any of these other employers to the idea of the bill? And has there been maybe a bit of resistance, a bit of pushback from them?
No, I've spoken to a few companies, and don't get me wrong, Centrica, the chief exec of Centrica, actually was good enough to meet me and discuss it, and was obviously perfectly aware of the bill. And we spoke about the issues facing the company and whatever. British Airways have less so, and to be fair, I've been much more critical of British Airways and their actions. But Mr. Walsh, sorry, I should say Willie Walsh, who was the chief exec of IAG, but formerly had been chief executive of British Airways and had tried to make some of these changes a decade ago. He is rather sensitive, so he was sending personal emails and responding to various points made in Transport Committee. So I don't think they've taken too kindly to some of the criticism that they've had. Let's put it that way.
And of course, I mean, this hasn't been an easy time for the aviation industry in particular. Clearly, lots of people have been told not to travel. You know, some airlines have virtually grounded their whole fleets earlier in the pandemic. Do you think, just speaking more generally, not just about BA, but for everybody that works at Glasgow Airport, is there a concern that maybe there just isn't a good way back for the aviation industry, at least in the short to medium term, and that maybe there is going to need to be some major changes to the way the industry operates?
I think that there may have to be changes to how things operate. It's probably a given. We just don't know what changes and what level of changes they may end up being. But there's huge anxiety in the industry, not just locally at Glasgow, but obviously nationally and internationally. And it's been incredibly frustrating because back in, I want to say March, I think it was March, the Chancellor had essentially promised sector specific support. The Transport Secretary, I stood in the same hotel ballroom as the Transport Secretary, who said he would stand by the industry and support them. That hasn't happened. The only government in the first few months to actually give any sector specific support was the Scottish Government when they um, give them a year free of non domestic rates. And yet, not only have they not brought this forward, they have now essentially tried to kick the industry when it's down because, and just in the last few weeks, the government or the Treasury has decided that VAT-free shopping airports would be discontinued, which is it came out of the blue because the Treasury themselves said that they were minded for it to continue. They had a consultation, and almost unanimously, the respondents said it should continue. Not only should it continue, it should be expanded to our former European EU partners and travels to and from there as well. But instead, the Treasury have decided to abolish it altogether, which will cost Glasgow Airport certainly millions of pounds, lots of jobs at a time when the airport and the industry can least afford it.
Now, we have been looking at the economy on a slightly wider level, and obviously there have been businesses that have made redundancies already in preparation for the end of furlough. They knew that was coming, they knew that was going to be a cliff edge for them in terms of their income, and had planned and made redundancies already. Now that the furlough scheme has been extended, do you expect any of those businesses to maybe think about rehiring some of those workers?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I've just today I've been speaking to this morning, speaking to employers who made staff redundant this week, and obviously I'm encouraging and I'm hopeful they will re-engage those staff, even if it's even for the furlough period, just to make sure that they've got some guaranteed income over this period of time. But the way this has been handled by UK government has, don't get me wrong, I welcome this U-turn, and we've been calling for it for months, and it was staring not just us, but staring the Chancellor in the face that this is something he had to do. Why he chose to, well, we know why he chose to wait until the last day. It's because essentially, with an English lockdown looming, the south and or southeast of England required it. There'd been no intention of taking this sort of action when it was Liverpool, Manchester, or indeed the devolved administrations in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast asking for the self same thing. It was only when the South East of England was needing it, the Treasury or the Chancellor found the magic money tree again and extended it. But it's been nowhere. Again, I'm speaking to quite a handful of employers this morning, and trying to plan as an employer has been extremely difficult. And when you're making a decision on the final day to extend it by a month, and then about a week later to then extend it by a further 5 months, businesses have no certainty in that, even short-term certainty in terms of employment. And obviously, when they don't have that, it's the employees that feel the pinch and ultimately will face the consequences of that uncertainty. So while I welcome it, it's come far too late. It should have been done a lot sooner, and it could have saved a lot more jobs had he done so.
And I mean, you've given some indication there, but there have been a series of decisions, particularly coming out of the Treasury, that have been kind of told. We've been told for maybe weeks, nothing is going to change. We've made our decision. This is the policy. And then with a day or two to go, we've seen a reversal. We've seen some sort of change. And in some cases, that's been welcome, like, as you say, the reintroduction or the extension of the furlough scheme. But it also does add a lot of confusion and a lot of difficulty for planning. What do you think is going on in Whitehall that we've seen so many of these kind of last minute changes of direction?
Well, I suppose to start with, I should probably. I'm certainly not one to defend the UK government, and I don't intend to do so. But the only point I would make is this is a difficult and fast-moving situation, and there will be decisions made by UK government and all governments that will need to be taken quite late and at short notice. No, nobody's denying that. But this furlough decision is something that was staring us in the face for months. That is no defence for the furlough decision, but others will need to be made quite quickly on a reactive basis. And I think a lot of people understand that. But there's certainly a lot of stress inside that UK government at the moment. I think there's different factions pulling one way or another, and the Treasury and the Chancellor seems to have an inordinate amount of power and influence. He is the Chancellor, but you would think he would take his directions from the Prime Minister a little quicker than perhaps he has. But certainly, the rumours in Westminster, the various government departments are desperately trying to get the ear of the Treasury for support for this and support for that, and are really struggling to do so. So the Treasury seem to have much more power and influence than perhaps they should have, in my view.
And do you think with the extension of the furlough into the spring now, do you think that is enough, or do you think there is still more financial support that the Treasury needs to pony up?
I certainly think that more support is necessary. I think March may well not be enough in any event, because we know that we hope that in March we'll be perhaps in the middle, or we don't know the timescales of some sort of vaccine rollout. Touch wood, let's hope that's the case. But we don't know where we're going to be. So I think for businesses, some more certainty on that basis, even for the Chancellor to say, if we're in this position, we're minded to extend it. It doesn't have to give a cast iron guarantee of X, Y, and Z, but at least some sort of certainty that if we're still in a similar position, that support will be there would be good. But there's so many. There's the 3 million excluded who haven't had a penny from the government. Who, not just ourselves, but many across the house, including Conservatives, have been shouting for in terms of support. They just haven't budged on this. The self-employed haven't seen enough support. There are directors, and when we think of directors, we always think of well-paid and well-off folk, but that's not the case with a great many directors of businesses who have not had support either. So there's lots of people who I think are crying out for some support. Plus the £20 uplift in universal credit, one should not only be made permanent, but should be expanded to legacy benefits. And then you come back to actual business support as well, which would be likes of aviation, hospitality, tourism, areas that are crying out for further support from the government.
And as we said, this is a decision that we had heard briefings that said this wasn't going to happen, and then it did happen. But it's not just on this kind of announcement. Throughout the last few months, we've seen the devolved governments just not briefed, not given information, both on COVID related issues and on Brexit related issues. What do you think is going on that the devolved governments have been getting such short shrift from the UK government, really, I guess, since the election at the tail end of last year?
Well, there's supposed to be a respect agenda in play, but we're not seeing much of it at the moment. I don't know if it's arrogance or just chaos down there, or a mixture of the two, arrogance and chaos. I don't know, but certainly the devolved administrations have been treated shabbily. Obviously, Kate Forbes and Nicola Sturgeon have decisions to make in terms of what they do in terms of business support or public health measures. I mean, you're not given the information to be able to take those decisions until after decisions have been taken and announced, often in the press or social media, certainly before we hear of them, or indeed the Scottish or Welsh or non-Irish governments have heard them. It's bonkers. It's simply not good enough, and it just shows that the union simply doesn't work. And I think more and more people are seeing that the union doesn't work, and obviously that's evidenced by the latest poll that shows, I think it's 12 polls in a row now that shows support for independence. And I think we can now start to call it almost a settled will of the Scottish people. I said, I think it was Monday, there was a COVID-19 debate that UK government's handling of this. I think we've seen a poll just a couple of weeks ago from one organisation that said that had the support for independence at 58%. And I said on Monday, if the government continue to handle things the way they do, it won't be long before we see the first poll at 60%. And I firmly believe that if they continue with this, carry on, and also continue to try and state that Scotland won't have a referendum despite what might happen in an election in May, I think all you'll see is support for independence go up and up. It's undemocratic nonsense from the UK government.
Well, this was a topic I wanted to get onto anyway. Obviously, you're dealing with workers' rights with this bill at Westminster. That's not something that the Scottish government has any power over. It's a reserved issue. How big a problem do you think that is, that there are these reserved issues that the Scottish government can't deal with, and the impact that then has on the issues that they do deal with?
It's huge. I should also point out that the Scottish Government fully support the bill as well. I've got a letter from Jamie Hepburn, Scottish Government Minister, that outlines support for the merits of the bill. But there's still, even after these years of devolution, there's still a great many people out there who don't understand who's in control of what, because we've still got lots of emails, or you'll see it on social media, in response to various tweets and posts and what have you. Why don't the Scottish Government do this and why don't they do that? It's because they can't, or because they can only do a certain element of this and what have you. Especially really about situations like this, really bring it home in terms of the lack of power that the Scottish Government has, no matter what they say in terms of the most powerful devolved institution in the world, or whatever nonsense they're saying this week. But until the Scottish Government has full powers over the economy, employment, environment, all of these issues, we just won't see the government that we want. At the moment, obviously, we've got a government we didn't vote for. We've got a Brexit we absolutely didn't vote for, and now they're trying to say, the Scottish Secretary said yesterday, trying to deny us a democratic right to an independence referendum if that's what the Scottish people so choose. I think that's nonsense, and we won't stand for it. It's up to the Scottish people when we have an independence referendum, not Alistair Jack or Boris Johnson or anybody else.
Now, we've We've seen the Scottish government do certainly do its best, but there have been difficulties in managing this whole pandemic for them. I wonder when you look at other countries of similar sizes, for example, New Zealand, and you see the challenges that Scotland has faced versus how somewhere like New Zealand has coped. How big an issue do you think the union is in as an impediment to management of the pandemic, given that obviously there are things that the Scottish government has wanted to do but hasn't been able to do or has relied on the UK government for that it hasn't been able to do itself. How big a problem do you think the union has been for managing the pandemic in Scotland?
Well, like all other aspects of government, or Nicola's trying to steer a government with one arm tied behind her back. And that's extremely difficult at the best of times, and it's very problematic when we're dealing with the situation, the pandemic situation that we see. You can see the quick actions other countries have been able to take across the world that we have been unable to take, and we've been waiting on confirmation of X and Y from the UK government before decisions could potentially be taken, or be taken as timorously as we would like. But I think you have to say, despite all of those things, the Scottish government and Nicola has been fantastic throughout this period. So transparent and honest, and empathetic. It's essentially three things that the UK government have not been, and I think that's why you're seeing not just poll ratings for the SNP and for independence on the rise, but you're seeing the approval ratings for the First Minister at just stratospheric levels. I mean, I think in a speech on Monday in Scotland, I think she has a 109-point lead over Boris Johnson in terms of approval rating. I've never seen anything like that in the 30 or so years that I've been a sad political geek.
You're not a sad one. I mean, you're seem quite a cheerful
Well,
one most
I
of the
was
time.
when I was 9 and 10 years old. I think you could maybe call me been. I was quite sad, been as political as I was, but maybe not so much now.
Well, one of the criticisms of the independence movement during this campaign, during this period, has been this idea that Scotland would be too small, too poor to manage some of the expenses of the pandemic, like the furlough scheme, for example. We've been told that's something that only the broad shoulders of the UK could manage. What do you think of that argument, and how do you respond to it?
Without swearing, no, it's absolute nonsense, and I still find it bizarre. They roll out this argument, and you hear the phrases like the might of the UK Treasury and all the rest of it. It's nonsense. The UK is borrowing money the same as other countries are to deal with this situation. I could list you any number of small countries and the actions they've taken to throughout a situation, be it New Zealand or what have you. But I suppose look at Ireland. Ireland are right next to us. Not only have I mentioned them because they have a ban on firing and rehiring, but they have essentially a furlough scheme in place, which the UK Treasury would have you believe that Scotland couldn't and wouldn't be able to afford. So it's an absolute nonsense. And when we actually get into another independence campaign proper, I'm looking forward to kind of laying some of these demons to rest, because the argument's had its time. It's dated, and I think if the Better Together UK government, whatever the campaign is, decide to go down that route, they will not find it getting anywhere the same traction that it had previously. You can see from polls, the Scottish people think that Scotland will be economically more prosperous, excuse me, with independence, and they trust the Scottish government to make these decisions more than the UK government.
Well, I was about to ask you about that question, in that we have seen that shift on the economic question, as well as other things like people saying, more than 60% of people, for example, saying they thought Scotland would have more pride in itself as an independent nation. I wonder, You brought up those magic words, the settled will. Do you think these are ideas that are pretty well set in people's minds now, or do you think that in a tough campaign, a lot of those people could be persuaded to swing back?
Well, I suppose you only have to look at, there's two things. Look at where we started in, I suppose back in 2012 in terms of independent support, and where we ended up. We made huge strides throughout that campaign, and I would hope that in a campaign we would be able to make further strides and increase support for independence. But obviously, you have to be a realist as well. And if the campaign against independence is run a lot better than it was in 2014, perhaps they can make progress with the voters, the soft yeses, the people who are we've recently won over. But you also just have to look at what's happening in the US at the moment, without talking about recent pronouncements and ridiculous lies from the president. Look at the polls. The polls all suggested a massive Democrat victory, and they may well win in the end. But the polls were very wrong in their predictions. So polls are one thing, and election day and votes are a completely different thing. So the polls are great and obviously show that momentum that's with us. And I think it's becoming, if it's not the settled will, it's certainly becoming the settling will of the Scottish people. But it's up to us to continue to work hard to win the trust of the people. And that's not just about independence, that's about showing um, good governance, leadership, about showing good representation, even at a local level. As an MP, I mean, I hear stories all the time about people who um, haven't voted SNP in the past and certainly didn't vote for independence, but because of the actions we've taken and I've taken as a representative at Westminster, either will strongly consider it or have been won over. So it isn't just about some of the kind of the obvious issues and pride issues and whatever else. It's just about leadership and good governance at times as well, and that's why you've seen this kind of slow and steady rise in support for independence, which has been accelerated obviously since Brexit and obviously to the UK government's handling of the pandemic.
So we were promised a vote on Scotland's independence before we left the EU. Now, formally, we have left the EU. We still have until December 31st before we leave all the institutions and before we stop being affected by EU rules. Obviously, the pandemic has got in the way of that planning for a referendum this year. Do you have a worry that now it might be too late, that once we're out of the EU's protection, once the British economy starts to change as a result, once things like the internal market bill are enforced, do you think it might get to the point where it becomes too late, where either the routes to independence are closed off, or where the economic damage in Scotland is so severe that independence becomes more frightening, perhaps?
No, I get the point, and I think there's a certain point where I had some of those concerns and was hoping that perhaps we might have the opportunity before the end of the transition period myself again for some of those reasons. But over the last few months, I've come to think that the inverse is true. I think if you see the arguments that we've been making um, for a number of months, over 2 or 3 years now, in terms of the impact of Brexit and how it's been handled, and obviously now how the pandemic's been handled as well. I think those concerns are perhaps not as certainly as strong as they were. I think the Scottish public can see what government are looking after their interests and are empathetic to their problems as opposed to what's happening in London. So I think that there's a disconnect, there's a growing disconnect between the Scottish public and the London government, and I think that's what you're seeing in the polls. And I don't really anticipate um, that changing. In fact, I think if anything, it will get worse for the UK government when the actual impact of Brexit, whether it's a no deal Brexit or whether it's a low deal Brexit, as it's been called, where you don't really see any or many of the advantages of EU membership. So in the day, that's a problem for them to worry about. I think from an independence campaign or supporter point of view, I think we have to continue with how we're doing things at the moment, get through this pandemic, and the minute we see the light at the end of the tunnel, then obviously I would hope that we are certainly pressing the accelerator pedal on independence. But the First Minister's right. We do have to deal with this huge issue of the pandemic that's in front of us just now. That's what we owe to the Scottish people. And I think many of those people who now support independence actually wouldn't forgive us if we were to go full on campaigning for independence right now.
Now, as you said, would there have been these 12 polls in a row showing a majority for independence? Some of those majorities 56, 58% bigger than the margin that the No campaign had back in 2014. So just before we go, first of all, how confident are you that that can hold and potentially even grow? And secondly, when would you expect a referendum to be heard? We've heard Michael Russell, for example, suggesting that September of next year is possible, assuming obviously that the SNP get the mandate they're looking for in May. Do you think that's realistic, or and if not, what are your hopes for when that referendum might happen?
Well, obviously, to a certain extent, we'll have to wait and see on that front. But I tend to agree with Michael. I think that there's a strong argument to be made for September next year. But again, that has to be with a fair wind behind us in terms of the pandemic. You can see America's obviously just held an election in the midst of a pandemic, and some of the problems that has thrown up. But certainly, assuming that we are over the worst of the pandemic, I think certainly next September would be a time, not least because it'll be 7 years since the last referendum, and according to the Good Friday Agreement, 7 years is a generation. So that we tend to put that, a political generation, I should say, which tends to put that argument to bed, which is the other one that the UK government often say. But I will say this though, there's obviously a lot of chat on mainly social media. If I'm honest, I don't really hear many members of the public talk about it, but about other independence parties and what have you, and trying to increase independence members through using a list vote. And to me, I think that's dangerous because, and you would say that you're an SNP MP and what have you, and that may well be part of it, but in reality, if you listen to what's been said many times by various government ministers, including the Prime Minister, when they talk about it, it's always about an SNP majority. I mean, we have an independence mandate at the moment. We have an SNP plus Greens mandate that has been voted on in Parliament, but the UK government won't recognise it. So I think it's key that, given that they repeat that themselves time after time about an SNP majority, because they obviously say at the moment we don't have one, that it does have to be both votes SNP and May to ensure that we have the SNP majority, and do not give the UK government that wiggle room that it's not an SNP majority, so therefore we won't recognise it. So that's all I would ask, is for folk to put their trust in the SNP, and we'll deliver independence if you deliver your support for us.
Well, Gavin Newlands, thank you very much for joining us. The best of luck, obviously, with the bill and that campaign, and I do hope you'll come back and talk to us about it sometime if there is any progress. So once again, our thanks to Gavin Newlands for joining us today. It was very interesting to hear from him, and I'm sure there are many people who would absolutely support the campaign that he's working on. That is all we have time for tonight, though. So thank you very much again to Gavin, and thank you for joining us as well. We do have to ask, if you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and it's your £5 a month that first of all lets us make the programmes that we make now, but also to keep building and keep growing into the better broadcaster that we believe Scotland deserves. If you're not able to support us financially, we absolutely do understand. The shows will always be free to view online, so you're always welcome to be part of the audience. But you can also make a big difference for us by helping to spread the word. First of all, follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube page, and click the bell icon there as well. And then share these shows around with your friends, your family, the Dougs in the street. Let them know who we are and what we do, and hopefully you can help to grow our audience, and that way we can again help us to become that better broadcaster for Scotland. And finally, the other thing that we need in order to become a better broadcaster is more people here. So if you're interested in getting involved with Broadcasting Scotland, whether that's working behind the cameras, working in the control room, working as a journalist, whatever that might be, or whether you'd like to try getting in front of the camera like me, then please do get in touch with us. We were talking just this afternoon about our plans for the election next year. We want to have people in every count across the country. So wherever you are in Scotland, if you're interested in helping us develop better journalism for Scotland, then please do get in touch. We would absolutely love to hear from you. That is absolutely all for tonight, though. I will be back on Sunday with the full Scottish, and then Gordon will be back on Monday with Scotland at 7 again. But until then, thanks for joining us and have a great weekend. Goodbye.